I'm KMBest. Let's take a look at the top decks to climb in Marvel Snap. First up on the list is High Evolutionary Control. Now, I do want to note, I don't go in order on these lists. I think all of these lists are roughly interchangeably good unless otherwise noted. But this list has been crushing for me, has been crushing for several of my friends, competitive players as well. And it just fundamentally relies on very powerful plays like Spider-Man and Storm to lock down one lane, and then you win the other lane with an extremely large Hulk. There are some weaknesses the deck has. Killmonger, for example, a little bit tough to beat when you rely so heavily on one-cost cards. If you want a bigger breakdown of this deck as well as some gameplay, I will have a video linked in the description where I go over this deck in depth. But it would be a disservice to you in talking about the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap to not talk about this list. It is an extremely powerful high evolutionary list. It is my current top high evolutionary deck list. And I personally believe that if you bought high evolutionary, this shell or something similar to it is going to be the best way to play the card. Now, this Patriot list has been around for a while, but the buff to Invisible Woman means that you can now use Invisible Woman to win those Enchantress matchups that you otherwise wouldn't win. And that is a really important addition to this list. I also have a Super Skrull in here. I'm a little teched out against the mirror. The default option to run in that slot would be Wave, but I am running a Super Skrull because I have a ton of respect for this list and because I think I can try to point slam with Kitty Pryde decks without relying on Wave to make me win those matchups. I could be wrong about that. If you see a ton of Kitty Pryde, that would be why Wave is in the deck. You can also use your Wave a little bit offensively so you can get down a 6-cost card on turn 4 in the matchups that are not Kitty Pryde decks. So Wave has a lot of upside here. I just genuinely hate playing Patriot mirrors, and if I can play one card that makes me win a Patriot mirror, I'm going to do that. That's why the Super Skrull is in there for me. Another flex spot is a Brood versus Ultron. Some lists, once you have Wave in there, because Wave allows you to run more 6-cost cards, end up putting an Ultron in the list as well. I think this is a totally acceptable substitution if you want to make it. Speaking of Kitty Pryde, it's just a force. I personally believe that if cards like Wave and Sandman didn't exist, these decks would be running absolutely roughshod all over the meta. This deck is so powerful, it forced our classic mid-range archetype of Darkhawk Zabu to run Wave specifically to respect it, because the floor of this deck is just so high, and the ceiling of this deck is also so high. It just puts out an astonishing amount of points, so if you don't have a plan for this deck, you will lose to it. So, for example, in the Lockdown deck, our plan is lock down one lane, and then lock down another lane so they just can't play any cards on the final turn of the game. If you're running Wave, your plan is play Wave on turn 5 and get them that way. But this deck has a lot of room for adaptation, and a variation of this deck in the hands of Equinox, whose links you will be able to find in the description, won the most recent Snap Battle Arena. So let's take a look at that list and talk about what makes it different from the base list. So the major differences you'll note are they managed to include tech slots without dropping America Chavez. Traditionally, people have been modifying this deck to include things like Shang-Chi at the expense of Chavez, but no, that's not happening here. Instead, we lose Iceman, we lose the Collector, and we lose Falcon in order to gain Super Skrull, Iron Man, and Invisible Woman. Invisible Woman and Iron Man do a little bit of your job in terms of playing around Wave, while Super Skrull exists mostly for the ongoing Patriot deck, obviously copying their Onslaughts, Iron Mans, even their Patriots will buff your Mysterios and the demons you get from the hood. Now, one thing that really strikes me about this build, though, is that I ended up very sold on Invisible Woman and Iron Man. Specifically Iron Man I ended up very sold on because there are a lot of lists that are just trying to put points out and just beat you with points. Like if they're expecting to win with a 20 power Hulk, you can beat that with a 3 power Iron Man and like some other units. That's really good. But the Super Skrull strikes me as like a specific tech slot devoted almost entirely to the Patriot matchup, and that means what I think this deck represents is the archetype moving forward. So now you see what can be done in this shell, the specific matchups that they're attempting to target. And I think that's what really impressed me about the deck building here, because when I first saw this list, I was like, I don't know. I like Invisible Woman. I don't know about Iron Man. I really don't know about Super Skrull. But in a tournament metagame, when you have these specific plans for specific matchups that they're not prepared to answer, it's one of the most powerful things you can do. Next up is Classic Sera, and it's just good. This deck is good. It has answers to stuff. It has threats. It's good. I personally prefer playing the Hitmonkey, Kitty Pryde versions of this list. I know some will talk about the Zabu Darkhawk versions. I think those are pretty compelling as well. But I personally end up more on this side, although I do think it's possible the Zabu Darkhawk versions, especially the one that Educated Collins took to the snap-offs with a top end of death, could be much better into Wave. I think that's like a pretty... You could make that argument to me, and I think Collins specifically has always been super talented at solving for specific matchups, and I think he did a really good job in terms of solving for specifically Wave with his list, although I'm not sure I'm like sold enough to like run it here, obviously. I think it's like a very specific list, but I do think he did a great job on that deck building. As far as this list, your playlines are simple. You do have to be aware of Wave as a thing that will beat you, because after all, Wave prevents your Sera turn explosions, so if you can play around it, you do. If you expect a Wave, you start playing a bunch of cards on turn 5 instead. You can also look at playing Invisible Woman in here. I do wonder, like, the main things this archetype gains over Bounce are the tech cards and the easy matchups against things that are vulnerable to the tech cards, so Killmonger, Shang-Chi, and Enchantress. You have a plan in every matchup. It's just, there's a ton of Wave on ladder. It's like one of the defining cards of this metagame, and you do have to be aware of it. I would be remiss if I did not include a Galactus list in my tier list, because part of the goal of this tier list is not just for me to tell you what decks are good, but so you can watch this for like 10 minutes and have an idea of what you're going to see on ladder. You're going to see this, so you should be prepared for it. Galactus is one of the best decks in the game at asking a very simple question and demanding a very specific answer. Do you have the thing that turns off Galactus? No? Okay, go next. And you have to be aware of this whenever you see like Electro or an early Wave on 4 with like a weird card like a Yondu before it. You have to know this is Galactus, or you're gonna lose more cubes, because a lot of them, the good ones, are gonna be snapping on the turn they play Galactus, and that is kind of, you're gonna lose an extra cube if you don't recognize what's going on. So look at this deck list, look at the cards in it, make sure you know, and make sure you have a plan for Galactus when you play Marvel Snap. Another thing to note here is that this Galactus list is not just a pure Galactus list. Nimrod plans with Destroyer, Shuri plans with Destroyer and Taskmaster. You don't end up actually only using Galactus to win, and so a lot of the times you'll leverage the threat of Galactus, how much people are afraid of Galactus, in order to beat them. Another thing you can do is Doc Ock their counters out of their hand. That will also work. You are asking one question most of the time, and then if they haven't answered that one question, you are asking a separate question, which is, can you beat two really big guys? And if they can't, then you win. Welcome to Galactus. I also wanted to highlight this list made by Freddy Babes, who used it to win the snap-offs, which is a bit of a unique format. You couldn't have any cards in both deck lists, so there was no overlap allowed. But then this list put 2 players in the top 8 of the Snap Battle Arena. Now, I do think it is a list that is doing generically powerful things, but it does run the risk of getting run over by Invisible Woman Patriot and Kitty Pryde decks. So it's a list that I think has to adapt to those decks in order to succeed, but this is the basic shell for High Evolutionary, right? The main flex spot is Luke Cage. Right now, we're teched against other Evo decks. I think maybe we start exploring, can we fit Wave in there? What do we have to do to beat the Kitty Pryde decks, and what do we have to do to take back our matchup against Invisible Woman Patriot after that swung in their favor by the inclusion of Invisible Woman? So if you want to start brewing with High Evolutionary, I think most High Evolutionary decks start looking like this and then branch off. If you go compare this to the High Evolutionary Lockdown deck, you can see how it looks like, oh, it's kind of like this, but instead of X, Y, and Z, we run, you know, A, B, and C. So this is sort of a baseline list that I did want to disseminate. You're going to see it on ladder. I think it's kind of in the larval stage right now, but it's clearly very, very, very powerful, and you should respect it, and you should expect, you know, this is like the default high evolutionary list. So definitely, I would say you can look into starting here and moving forward if you want to find a way to customize this list to beat the stuff, you know, in this video. Thanks so much for watching another week's tier list. I cannot wait to see what the new metagame holds, because there's been so much development already from high evolutionary. Like, I went from being kind of down on the card to being incredibly up on the card. Who knows where I'm going to be next time, but like, I am so impressed with what I've seen from the card so far. After spending about 48 hours thinking, it's like kind of good, now I'm like legitimately sold on it, I think. And so I know a lot of people are going to be saying, like, you know, KM, should I buy high evolutionary? I think it's quite powerful. It is still, like, you know, when you look at the Freddy Babes deck, it is a mid-range deck that needs to adapt to metagames, but especially the Lockdown Shell shows great adaptation potential. I genuinely think high evolutionary is a pretty powerful card. I know people are going to be asking me that. So given that he's a big bad, I would, generally speaking, give you a thumbs up on purchasing it. I just figured I would throw that in this video because it's like kind of the #1 question I get. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. I will see you in the next one. Remember, have a great day. Like, subscribe to my channel. I almost forgot to say that. Do the dopamine thing. I will see you in the next one.